Good afternoon and good evening. Peace be upon you. We come back to you with South24. We have a webinar under the title "The Consequences of the Conflict in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden." I'm the moderator of this webinar, Osan Bin. So as you know, on the 12th of January, the US and the UK forces launched strikes against multiple targets, Houthi targets in Yemen, as they continued their drone and missile attacks against the commercial ships in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. And the Houthis are saying that they are targeting only the Israeli ships or those destined to Israeli seaports. But some observers believe that the continuation of the lethal and the brutal Israeli campaign on civilians in Gaza allowed the Houthis to have a kind of popularity in the region as part of the axis of resistance supported by Iran. On the other hand, the US and the UK strikes, according to the US officials, led to the weakening of the Houthi capabilities, which they use to attack the ships and the seamen in one of the most important waterways in the world. Economically, the Houthi attacks affected the commercial activities in Bab el-Mandab and the Suez Canal, and the ships are now using the Cape of Good Hope, and this is more expensive, and this affected the international navigation as well as the shipping activities in the Yemeni seaports. Recently, we have seen a very sharp rise in the commercial shipping fees, and this will affect the peace process in Yemen, as well as the UN endeavors for a comprehensive and inclusive peace process in the country. The country is devastated by a conflict, protracted conflict for 9 years, and the U.S. Department of State has designated the Houthis as a terrorist organization recently. On the other hand, the Houthi threats are highlighting the criticism to the West policies towards Yemen and how the West is dealing with the threats posed by the Houthis. For years, the US and the UK were pushing for an agreement in Yemen, including the Stockholm Agreement on Hodeidah in 2018. And that agreement gave the Houthis a strategic advantage on the Red Sea, the control over the Hodeidah seaport, as well as the coastline of the west of Yemen. And in this context, for example, Mr. Idris Zubaydi, the member of the PLC, requested support to the local forces with the military arsenal, gear, and intelligence in order to combat the Houthis. And in light of the previous threats against the global economy and the fears of the expanded circle of violence and conflict in the region, especially with Iran and its proxies in the Middle East, and with the fears that the conflict with the Houthis will deepen the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. In this webinar, we will be discussing 3 topics. The first topic will be about understanding the current situation, the military and the navigation levels, and the impact of the conflict on the shipping lines and the navigation in the Red Sea. And number 2, we will discuss the ramifications or the repercussions of the US and the UK strikes against the Houthis, as well as the designation of the Houthis as a terrorist group. And then in the third topic, we will discuss the importance of securing Bab el-Mandab Strait area, the Gulf of Aden, and the international strategy in dealing with the area in the future. Our guests for this webinar are an elite of the experts who are experts in the files that we'll be discussing. We will have our colleague from Orion. We'll have Dr. Marta Furlan, the research program officer at the FTS, and the non-resident fellow at the Orion Policy Institute, and the fellow at the Center on Armed Groups. From Cairo, we have Dr. Eman Zahran, political science teacher, specialized in international relations and regional security. And We have Fernando Carvajal, who is the political expert and former member of the UN Security Council panel of experts on Yemen. And from Aden, we will have Yaqub Alsufyani, the regional director of the South24 Center office in Aden. And in the translation, we have Mr. Bassim Aulaqi. So the time of this webinar will be 1 hour, in addition to 20 more minutes for Q&As. And if you want to ask a question, you can raise a hand, and we'll allow you to speak and to comment after the remarks of the panelists. The panelists will have 6 minutes each. We will start. Of course, the interpretation is available in Arabic and in English for those who need translation. So we will start with Mr. Fernando. A question to you, Fernando. So we want to know your assessment of the US and the UK strikes against the Houthis that started on the 12th of January. Do you think that these strikes are decisive, or as some say, these are topical and very limited in their impact? Do they have a political nature related to the US elections, US presidential elections, and as some say? Fernando, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Barraois, and thanks to South24 for hosting this panel, very timely. Thank you for the invitation, and happy to be here with the other panelists. Definitely to your last point on your question, I think President Biden would much rather avoid this entire incident in 2024 than to engage a new military operation. Definitely, this is not what a Democratic president does prior to an election year. I believe that we really need to focus on the letter, on the specific wording, on the statement from the Defense Department regarding Operation Prosperity Guardian. It was very brief and it was very direct. It's a defensive operation, and it's a defensive operation in the name of global trade through Bab el-Mandab. So from the beginning, the mobilization of this operation, of the vessels under the operation, which is based in Bahrain, it is still housed in Bahrain, which hosts U.S. naval forces. It is an operation, not a task force. We know that there are multiple task force operating Aden Gulf, Red Sea, and Arabian Sea, but this is a specific operation against the threats emanating from Houthi-held territory. Because it is defensive, the nature of the strikes that you mentioned against Houthi military targets on Yemeni territory are retaliatory. They're not an escalation. Houthis have escalated. You can't have an escalation after an escalation. The U.S. military, along with the British naval forces, Air Force, are striking at specific military targets on Houthi-held territory. This is very interesting. Again, I highlight the fact that it's headquartered in Bahrain. This is an intelligence gathering. This is after years of intelligence gathering. This is a big group of military advisors and military forces, perhaps sharing intelligence from the Saudi-based operations room. We know that the criticism for Biden is the timeliness of the of the operation, but this is what the Houthis chose to strike the vessels and to impact the global trade through Bab el-Mandab. To your point about the criticism of President Biden and deciding to do this operation, we understand that the progressive left, anti-war movement would much rather see diplomacy than these military operations. But we know that for the last 9 years, diplomacy has failed when it comes to halting the Houthis or changing their behavior. It failed. I like to highlight it failed September 22nd, 2014, when all the parties signed the peace and partnership agreement in Sana'a. It failed in December when the Houthis pushed a change in cabinet away from Prime Minister Basundwa to Mr. Khalid Baha. It failed in March 2015. As a reminder, there was a delegation of Houthis in Saudi Arabia prior to March 25th, 2015, where the Saudis were trying to de-escalate. It failed in Kuwait, it failed in Geneva, it has failed in Muscat, it has failed in Amman, and mostly, as you highlighted, Mr. Barawiz, it failed in Stockholm. Precisely what we have today, what the international community, what the region is going through today, we can pin it back to the failure of the Stockholm Plan of December 2018 and the failure of the UN mission in Hodeidah that was established soon after the Stockholm meetings. They have failed to identify and de-escalate the threat from the Houthis. Let's remember that the Amalaka, the Giants Brigade, were within 10 kilometers of entering Hodeidah in November 2018, along with the Guards of the Republic, and they were halted and they were turned back. The Guards of the Republic in Amalaka were forced to retreat south of Hoja, along into Taiz as well, and this has allowed the Houthis, as you mentioned, to extend their control of the Red Sea coast throughout the Tehama, from the border of Hodeidah and Taiz all the way to the border with Saudi Arabia. So when we look at the alternatives available for the region and for the international community, definitely Operation Prosperity Guardian is one that, with reluctance, is the move against the Houthis in order to degrade their capabilities at the moment.
ألا ترى السيد فرناندو إذا
Don't you see, Mr. Fernando, if don't you these strikes are very late? The Houthi attacks against the international shipping are since 2017, 2018, and they have targeted different ships and vessels. So why this operation is too late?
Absolutely. We know, for example, that as of October 2022, when the so-called UN ceasefire expired, the Houthi, initially Mohammed Abdel Salam, Mohammed al-Houthi, Mohammed al-Buhaiti, their first statements that morning were a threat to the oil facilities in the south and to any oil or gas tanker approaching Belhav or any port in Hadramaut. And so this is, and when folks, anti-war activists, point to Gaza as the primary driver for these threats and operations from the Houthis, they are merely amplifying Houthi narratives. This has nothing to do with Gaza. They've not acted since 2002. The Houthis have never acted against Israeli targets when they first came out in Sada. These are a continuation of Houthi tactics within the context of the war against their Yemeni rivals and against Saudi Arabia. As you mentioned, the Houthis not only attacked Saudi and Emirati ships before 2020, but they've also hijacked an Emirati ship, confiscated an Emirati ship before 2020. So these are typical Houthi actions. The timeliness of their action going against the Galaxy leader are part of a wider strategy, for sure, that is linked to the axis of resistance under Iran, from whom they've received these capabilities on mid to long range drones and missiles since 2017. The timeliness, whether the U.S., let's remember that the U.S. is not a party to the civil war in Yemen. The U.S. is not a member of the Saudi Arabia-led coalition. So they're not allowed to enter this war in particular. And any strikes on the Houthi territory prior to January would have been illegal under U.S. law because it requires congressional permission. And one more thing that I failed to mention about the Operation Prosperity Guardian, it was
سيد فرناند سنعود طبعا لهذا المحور.
Mr. Fernando, we'll come back to that and we'll discuss it later. I just wanted to jump quickly to Dr. Marta, and I'll ask her about the level of engagement from Iran in the escalating situation in the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, and the linkages between the Houthis and Iran. Do they receive orders from Iran? Reuters said that some Iranian and Hezbollah experts are helping the Houthis to direct the attacks from inside Yemen. Dr. Marta, you have the floor, please.
Thank you. And again, thank you to South24 for the invitation to this webinar and for putting together this meeting that touches on such an important topic. I think when it comes to Iran, as Fernando was rightly pointing out, Iran has been involved with supporting the Houthis, both with the materially with the weapons for many years. Is nothing new. Also with know-how, so we've been for many years known about Hezbollah presence within Yemen, in northern Yemen, in the areas controlled by the Houthi. We know about Houthi going to receive training in Lebanon. We know about the presence of Houthi-connected media facilities in Beirut, in the neighborhoods controlled by under de facto control of Hezbollah. So this is nothing new. What is interesting to see in this context is that the investment that Iran has been making over the past years on the Houthis, seeing the Houthis as a low-cost investment to get a possibility for Tehran to project its power in the region, in the Gulf of Aden, in the Gulf Peninsula, is now paying a very good paying off for Iran, because this is giving the opportunity to Iran to indirectly intervene in this conflict that we're seeing playing out in the Middle East. It's allowing Iran, with its the components of its axis of resistance in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Yemen with the Houthis, to intervene in the confrontation, to take a side without Iran having to take a step directly, meaning that it can always say that it has nothing to do with it. It can save the face. It can claim and defend the claim that the parties of the axis of resistance are acting autonomously and independently, and the level of connection, though, is certainly there now. I think the Houthis, as it has been long said, are within the axis of resistance probably the group that is most autonomous, that has the greatest capacity of taking its own decisions that reflect its own interests within Yemen. Abdul Malik al-Houthi is no Nasrallah, but still the connection is there, and we see that Iran is using it very carefully in this confrontation, and that, as I mentioned before, the Houthis have been a very good investment from an Iranian perspective. It didn't cost much, and it is giving them a lot of advantage in this specific context that we're seeing playing out now for the moment being, at least, in taking a direct part in this confrontation, doesn't want to escalate the war. It has been saying so. It has been acting accordingly. It doesn't want a direct confrontation with the US, with Israel, but it certainly wants to use its proxies, such as the Houthis, to benefit from these wall tensions that we're seeing playing out in the region, and hopefully, possibly, from an Iranian perspective, even drive out the US of the region.
دكتورة مارتا 8 سنوات
Dr. Marta, 8 years of conflict and blockade in Yemen, which was a complete blockade from the side of the Arab coalition. This did not prevent the Iranian arms and experts from reaching to the Houthi-controlled areas. The operation now that is led by the United States and the United Kingdom, will this operation be more effective in preventing this access?
Well, I think it's difficult to say. I believe that no, meaning that there has been over the years a capacity on the part of Iran to bring capacity to the Houthis. So there is now in the north part of Yemen, under the Houthi control, there are facilities for weapons production. There has been a transfer not only of material capabilities, but a transfer, I believe, most importantly, of know-how. So I think that now the Houthis are certainly in a stronger position than they were 8 years ago. This is something that cannot be reverted back. And if we look at the reports coming out, then it seems that still there is a capacity on the part of Iran of reaching the Houthis, of reaching them with its own trainers, with the trainers allied to Hezbollah. So I think for sure the presence of the US and the Operation Prosperity Guardian is raising the challenges, but I do not think that it's at this point enough to revert the tendency that we are seeing that has been consolidating itself for so many years now.
سننتقل دكتور مارتا شكرا سننتقل
Thank you, Dr. Marta. We'll move to Dr. Eman Zahran from Cairo, and we'll ask her about the position of the countries or the states along the Red Sea coastline, the actions of the US and the UK operation. How can we explain the absence of some important countries, including Egypt and Saudi Arabia? So they are absent from this US-led coalition against the Houthis. Why these countries are absent, and what are the reasons behind that? Dr. Iman, you have the floor. First of all, good evening, and thank you for this invitation to participate in this webinar. Well, frankly speaking, well, even the disturbances in the Red Sea are not affecting the countries around the coastline of the Red Sea. They affect the global trade and the global waterways. So the impact is obvious on Egypt, especially as Egypt did not participate in the Prosperity Guardian and the operation led by the US and the UK against the Houthi group. Egypt did not participate in this operation for a number of reasons. And please allow me to disagree with Dr. Fernando on the issue of the Houthi group or movement and the attacks by the Houthis against the Israeli ships and the ships that are routed to Israel based on the principle of the unity of all arenas that was established by Hamas, Hezbollah, and others since the 7th of October. As in Egypt, we see that, yes, we have been affected adversely by the Houthi attacks on the Red Sea. These attacks affected the global trade and the traffic in the Suez Canal, and it led to a very small number of ships crossing or passing through the Suez Canal, and this is resulting in declining revenues for the Egyptian treasury. But on the other hand, Egypt did not participate in this operation, and Egypt is working on managing the conflict. We have a very fixed position concerning using diplomacy and avoiding confrontations and the military solutions. So we have been always against the military operations. We try to use diplomacy. The idea of this operation is questionable from the Egyptian side, because this operation, will it bring back the idea of the international coalition to protect the security in the Red Sea? This is a critical issue that we faced in the past, and we have been raising this because there is the Joint Task Force 153 since 2023. It's in the Red Sea, and the function of this task force to stabilize the region and security-wise. This was a question mark for Egypt, and this led Egypt not to participate in this Prosperity Guardian operation. The other point in which I disagree with Mr. Fernando, we believe that the Houthi attacks are supporting the Palestinian cause, and they are a response to the Israeli attacks against the Palestinian territories, and therefore we cannot publicly stand against these attacks. Well, we have a fixed position in support of the Egyptian cause, and we have stated these positions since the 7th of October, and we delivered direct messages to the parties, and the statement of Egypt is clear. Different international forums, including the Cairo summit. Concerning the mechanism of the operation itself, the operation related to the US-UK strikes against the Houthi targets, in my estimation, the military operation was an attempt to renovate the U.S. presence in the region. Although the United States has departed different stations in the Middle East, and the United States is now coming back to the region. United States in the past wanted to go to the South Asia and Pacific region. Now the US is back to the region in order to support Israel. And this is problematic. The United States wanted to come back to the region from the door of Israel. And there have been some messages through these strikes against the Houthi targets. The other point, in my estimation, these strikes themselves are not related to protecting the commercial shipping in the Red Sea. These strikes are a political attempt in order to militarize the Red Sea. We had the task force in the Red Sea, and it was, I think, enough. But the United States is now trying through this operation and this coalition, maybe in the Arab region, we have always bad experiences with the international coalitions. They always fail, or they are frozen, or they result in stalemates in managing the political and the military situations. The other point, it's about the timing of this operation and these strikes. Some say that the timing of these strikes has come after different warnings sent to the Houthis, but I think this is incorrect. The timing is with the case that is brought against Israel in the International Court of Justice. And this is for the purpose of distracting the people from watching the case with the ICJ, and it's the first case of its kind. It's unprecedented, and this case was supported by many parties around the world. And the timing, I believe, has relevance to this case. Dr. Eman, Egypt did not take a side, and we have not seen any statement from Egypt concerning what is happening in the Red Sea. So, well, there was a statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Egypt. There was an official statement from the Egyptian Foreign Ministry about it. Yeah, but we did not directly talk about this issue. It did not mention the Houthis or these strikes. It talked about the Red Sea security. Do you think that Egypt is trying to keep distant from the conflict between Russia, because Russia is about to engage in a conflict with the West about the international waters and things like that? So do you think that Egypt is trying to keep distance? Egypt is not impartial here. Egypt issued a statement, and Egypt said that it is cooperating and communicating with everyone in order to allow the free navigation. But Egypt, yes, is trying to avoid the conflict, the escalation of the conflict. Before the Russian-Ukrainian conflict war, Egypt tried to keep distance. I don't think that Egypt is part of the non-aligned movement here. I think the timing for Egypt is not right to intervene, not only for Egypt, but for all Arab states, because the Houthi attacks, although they affect the international navigation and shipping with the soaring inflation and the economic crises that we see everywhere, the timing of these attacks is critical because it is about a very essential cause or issue for the Middle East and for the Arabs, which is the Palestinian issue. So there are different dimensions for this issue, including the threats against the shipping in the Red Sea. Dr. Eman Zahran, if we talk about the economic, we'll discuss the economic repercussions in the second topic. So I'll move now to Mr. Jacob from Aden. and he's an expert about the Houthis and their capabilities. And they'll ask him about the ability of the Houthis to be resilient and to withstand the U.S. Strikes, especially as these strikes are different from the Arab coalition strikes. And I believe yesterday there was a further escalation in these strikes. So will they affect the capabilities of the Houthis militarily and materially? On this issue, I believe that for the past few years, the years of conflict in Yemen, the Houthis have established a kind of resistance or immunity against the strikes of the Saudi-led Arab coalition. And the Houthis, they have invented methods for concealment of the weapons and the ammunition and the missiles. And Riyadh accused the Houthis more than once that they store the missiles and the weapons in densely populated areas, including civilian areas, such as the Sana'a International Airport. In addition to that, the Yemeni terrain is very difficult and they provide natural harbors for these weapons. And if we, concerning the present time, we cannot neglect the difference between the US capabilities and the Saudi capabilities at all levels, the military and the intelligence levels. And this means that the Houthis are affected by these strikes, or they will be affected in the future. We will see the impacts of that. So if we want to assess the impact of these strikes on the Houthis, I think the right question should be what is the size of damage the United States wants to inflict on the Houthis? The recent strikes against the Houthis that started on the 12th of January, these strikes are evidence that the United States is not willing to change the military situation of the Houthis or to affect them in terms of their capabilities. The military purpose of these strikes, it's a declared one. It's not a secret. It is to prevent them from launching more sea attacks and to destroy the weapons that may help them to do that. But for the foreseeable future, this operation may not continue. The U.S. military strategy may change and the United States may launch an overarching military campaign against the Houthis, and some international media outlets are talking about that. All this is pending on the behavior of the Houthis. I believe that the escalation in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden will continue as it is if the Houthis do not change course. In the past few weeks, we see that the Houthis are taking the lead and are doing the action, but the United States is doing the reaction. The Houthis, I believe, they plan to launch ballistic attacks and missiles against U.S. assets in the region. So the Houthis may expand their attacks. They may attack some U.S. bases in Djibouti and in neighboring countries. In addition to that, the U.S. bases in Iraq and in Syria are under attack by the Shia militias that are supported by Iran. The attacks against the Houthis recently, I believe, are the last resort for the U.S. I believe that the U.S. action escalated from the condemnation to the diplomacy to the UN Security Council resolution, reaching to these strikes with the United Kingdom. And I believe that these strikes are because of the increasing economic costs as a result of the rerouting of the ships and the avoiding of the Red Sea, which is a very important shipping waterway. And the second reason is a military one, which is the absence of the effectiveness of the defensive positioning the U.S. tried to apply in the first days of the operation, because they focused at the beginning on preventing the attacks of the Houthis. They failed, and they did not even limit these attacks, and the designation of the Houthis on the terrorist list is a further step by the United States in order to limit the effectiveness of the Houthis. Well, what you mentioned, the designation of the Houthis and the strikes and the continuation of this operation, well, what's the impact of this on the peace efforts led by the UN Special Envoy and the Saudi Houthi talks? So what's the impact of these strikes on these efforts and the peace process? And the Houthi escalation in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, will it lead to the discarding of the peace plan, or are the Houthis are taking advantage of that in order to achieve more gains? So after this operation, the level of their demands will increase. Yes, I believe that the political process and the political endeavors in Yemen are in a crisis now because of what is happening in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. At least I believe that these efforts are frozen now. And well, these efforts were just attempts to broker a political deal between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia. But these efforts today are halted and are frozen because of what is happening, and I don't believe that the negotiations or the talks will continue. No roadmap will be produced. The UN Special Envoy announced a roadmap, but it will not be concluded in light of these developments. And these developments gave opportunities for parties inside Yemen, the parties that felt that they have been excluded from the roadmap and from the peace process and the talks between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis. So these parties will take advantage of these developments. But you have referred to a very important point. I think the Houthis, they have learned from the past that more escalation leads to more concessions from the Saudi side. So, well, I believe that the observers need to observe the Red Sea and the Muscat in Oman, because the Americans may enter into talks with the Houthis because we have an ultimatum for the Houthis 1 month before they are designated or listed as a terrorist organization. So for these 30 days, we will see probably some political momentum. The Houthis may raise the bar, may make more demands from the United States. In the past, they avoided raising the level of their demands, and they were making the demands directly with the Saudis, but now they might have direct talks with the Americans, and they may overcome the issue of Gaza and the war in Gaza, and they may have direct demands or requests from the United States. Thank you, Yaqub. We move now to Dr. Marta, and we want to hear your assessment for the Chinese and Russian positions from what is happening in the Red Sea. Since the beginning of this crisis, how do you assess the position of the Chinese and the Russians and this military escalation? Will it lead to the failure of the Saudi-led peace process with the Houthis? And will it also lead to the collapse of the agreement that was sponsored by China between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Dr. Marta?
Yes, thank you. Well, I will pick on some of the points that Yaqub was also sharing before when it comes to the peace agreement and the Saudi-Houthi agreement. So I think in the current context, it's inevitable to see the fact that the Houthis are taking advantage of this situation, of the posturing that they've been taking in the Red Sea and their attacks to kind of change the cards that were on the table when it comes to the agreement with Saudi Arabia. And it is certainly their intention to tip the scale in their favor so as to go back eventually at some point to that negotiating table with capable of getting more concession from Saudi Arabia and in a stronger position. And when I think it's also interesting something that you're pointing out when it comes to the delicate position in which Saudi Arabia is finding itself. So when it comes to the responses that we've seen taken by neighboring countries, Saudi Arabia, of course, did not take part in Operation Prosperity Guardian, because for many countries in the region, including the UAE, Egypt, it would be taken aside against the Houthis that are clearly sticking up for the rights of the Palestinian people, which is something that no country in the region is ready to do. In the case of Saudi Arabia, then there is also a more complicated position, a more complicated calculus that relates to the peace agreement. Saudi Arabia has been trying for quite some time now to get out of this Yemeni quagmire. It has been trying to get out of the war in order to concentrate its efforts in the mega projects that it's been developing on the western coast of Saudi Arabia. It needs to do so peace, it needs to do so stability on the in the Red Sea, on the Suez Canal. So that's why Saudi Arabia has been asking since the very beginning from the United States to show restraint. And we saw it very recently in the comments by the Saudi Foreign Ministry. On top of this, there is also another consideration for the Saudis that explains the position that they've been taking with respect to these events, which is their interest not to compromise the detente that last March was reached with Iran, that for the Saudis was very important to reach, as it's part of this regional stability that is fundamental for the Saudis to concentrate on their internal projects, on their domestic projects that economically are putting so many efforts into developing. And this is something that Saudi Arabia doesn't want to compromise. On the other hand, and here I connect to something that I was sharing before, Iran is also certainly not...
دكتورة مارتا
Yes.
ألا ترين أنه نوعا من
Dr. Marta, don't you think that the position of Saudi Arabia is relatively weak because Saudi Arabia is silent while Iran is moving through its proxies in the region?
Yes, for
which is
sure.
around Saudi Arabia?
Yes, that's a great point. We see that Saudi Arabia is pretty impotent in front of these events. On the one hand, is desperately trying to wanted to continue the negotiations to get out of the Yemeni war, to sign this agreement with the Houthis, and it was getting pretty close to achieving that situation. Now, everything, all the cards got shuffled again, and the Saudis are in a very, as you rightly pointed out, in a weak and delicate position. They are caught in the middle, while Iran is benefiting from this all. It is managing to, as we were saying before, to use its proxies to advance its interests at a very low cost. This is very important to emphasize. And this imbalance between the high cost that the Saudis have been paying for the past years and the low cost that Iran has been paying has been a thread of the Yemeni confrontation since the very beginning. For Iran, investing on the Houthis in the Yemeni civil war has been something that paid off, but it extracted a very low cost. For the opposite has been true for the Saudis. They've invested a lot of money. The cost has been very high, also not in terms of economically, but also in terms of international image, strategically, security-wise. And they didn't get what they were hoping to get. So I think we're re-seeing the same dynamic that has characterized this regional engagement in the Yemeni conflict. It's playing out even today. Iran is in a strong position. The Saudis are very weak and impotent.
ماذا عن الموقف الروسي دكتورة
What about the Russian position, Dr. Marta? You did not tell us about the Russian position.
Yes, I want to be clear on this. I'm not really following Russia as closely, so I think perhaps other panelists are in a better position to address this question. I think on the case of China, we can see that certainly China has also been following these events very closely. Perhaps we can return to this later when we talk about the economic importance of this of the Red Sea, the Bab al-Mandab, the Suez Canal. China's been also paying a cost, as many countries worldwide. The flow of commerce that has been going from Asia to Europe, passing through the Red Sea, which is now challenged by these events, certainly as a cause for China. And it has been clear since the very beginning that China is closely following what's happening there.
شكرا لك يا دكتورة مارتا وطبعا
Thank you, Dr. Marta, and of course, Mr. Fernando. I'll ask you, Fernando, about the potential risks of the continued sea escalation on the economic and the humanitarian situation in Yemen. And Fernando, do you think that the Houthis are benefiting from these operations, from what they do? Some observers said that the Houthis, it's like blackmailing or imposing levies on the insurance companies and the shipping companies. So can the Houthis benefit economically from what is happening in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden?
Right. There was there was an interesting media
طبعا
report.
لا أريد أن أقاطعك دكتور فرناند.
I do not want to interrupt you, but maybe you can also comment on the previous statements by the panelists and the previous questions that I asked.
Sure. Thank you. First, on your question about Houthis blackmailing, we know that they never missed this opportunity. There was an interesting report a couple of weeks ago that a shipping company had approached the Houthis in offered to pay them in order to make sure that their vessels were not targeted during this. So that was definitely something. I haven't seen any follow-up on that, but that would definitely be something that the Houthis would welcome. One of the things that I do like to highlight is on China. Definitely China has egg on their face over the last 2 months, because since April, they wanted to bolster their position in the world, but specifically in the Middle East, by hosting Iran and Saudi, and claimed that their diplomacy, that their diplomatic approach was now inserting China into the Middle East region, and they would play a positive role, right? But yet we've seen that it has failed because China has been completely absent on the diplomatic track, whether it's between Houthis and the U.S. or Iran and Saudi or Iran and Israel. Recall that soon after the April meeting in Beijing, Iran made a promise to stop all military assistance to the Houthis. And yet, the U.S. and international navies operating in the Arabian Sea continue to seize vessels coming from Iran with weapons destined either for the Houthis or the Horn of Africa. With regards to the impact, whether the Houthis will escalate, I think, again, I will have to agree to disagree with Dr. Eman on the issue of the connection between Houthi operations and Gaza. I think the Houthis have a momentum. They have a long strategy, as Jacob mentioned, to secure the interest, and they will re-escalate at every round of negotiations in order to expand their benefits. That is a given. Right now, the Houthis are focused on securing the salaries for their employees and military in their territory. The Southerners, the SDC, the Southern Transitional Council, has already rejected this idea because the proposal is to take the revenue from oil and gas from the South to pay those salaries. And the Southerners have said that revenue needs to stay first in the South, in the liberated areas, and then it can be used for other purposes. We see the Houthis attempting to escalate in Bayhan. We see the Houthis using their positions near Turba in Aden, Turba in Taiz, and in Mukhaidas in Al-Baida to target the vessels in the Gulf of Aden. I've made this comment before to South24 and in other panels, where these Houthi activities in the Yemen context, these Houthi activities, this operation is primarily impacting the economy in Yemen. The southern economy, again, is being held hostage by the Houthis because this activity, targeting ships in the Gulf of Aden and then the Arabian Gulf, affects the traffic into Aden, into Mukalla, and into Mahra. On top of that, it is definitely affecting the shipping through Cairo. One of the interesting things that we need to note is the data of the number of ships going into Hodeidah port. This is very interesting. While everyone is focused on the impact on the global trade, if we look at the data on the Hodeidah port, it has tripled since October of last year. So the flow of commercial goods and the flow of aid going into Hodeidah port has tripled over the last 6 or 8 months. This means that the Houthis are not affected by their own operations. This means that the US and the international community are keeping an eye on the importance of the humanitarian aid flow into northern Yemen and are allowing these vessels that are often chartered by Houthi leaders themselves to continue bringing in goods through Hodeidah for the UN and for the open market. So this is, for me, when you mentioned, Ustad Barrawiz, the impact of the designation, this is where we can look at the potential impact and the actual effectiveness or the willingness of the Biden administration to grant concessions to the humanitarian sector, right? If after the 30 days, if after February 14, we don't see an impact on the flow of vessels into Hodeidah, we know that the Biden administration has granted sufficient exemptions for UN and international organizations and is cooperating with the Houthis in of commercial goods that they primarily drive. So this is something that we need to pay attention to over the next 15 to 20 days.
سنذهب شكرا
Thank you, Fernando. We'll come back to Dr. Eman Zahran from Cairo. How do you assess the economic ramifications for the continued escalation in the Red Sea on Egypt and the Suez Canal? And these developments, including the continued Israeli war against Gaza, will this lead to new coalitions in the region in which Egypt is a party to? Maybe the idea of the repercussions of the Houthi attacks and the Prosperity Guardian operation and the impact of that on the regional and the global economy, there are impacts, and these impacts are felt by Egypt. And for Egypt, the traffic through the Suez Canal has declined based on the latest statements from the Suez Canal Authority. Yes, there is less traffic in the canal, and there are other alternatives for the movement of goods, including the land transportation and the Cape of Good Hope. But according to the Egyptian authorities, this is temporary. As soon as these attacks are over, the attacks by the Houthis or by the US and the UK, if they cease the attacks, I believe that the United Kingdom has declared that it ceased attacks in the region. So I think this is very temporary, and then the situation will be restored to normality in the region, and the traffic of ships will resume. Well, but before the attacks, the global economy was already affected, and the shipping rates have increased globally, and this is has further escalated. The global economy is suffering in terms of the energy and food security and the supply chain crisis. And this is not linked to the traffic in the Red Sea only. It is a direct impact from the Russian-Ukrainian war and the impact on the Middle East. The other point, with the intensification of the attacks, the instability in the Red Sea may result in some blackmailing and some security agreements being concluded in the region. The companies may conclude contracts for protection, and this is being said in Europe now because in some European countries we see that elections are looming, and in the US as well. And Donald Trump talked about the commercial protectionism as a result of what is happening in the Red Sea. Another thing that is affecting the global economy and the regional economy in particular, uh, given the commercial and the economic projects in the region, the road and belt initiative and the Indian Silk Road. I think these projects will be affected given the existing disturbances in the Red Sea and the hotspots of conflict in the region. So, because a number of concerned countries are now destabilized, the economic route, we have seen a statement from those responsible for the Indian economic road or route, and they say that this project may be frozen as not only as a result of the Houthi attacks, but for other considerations. These Houthi attacks are against the ships that are distant to Israel, and there have been also Houthi attacks on Eilat seaport in Israel. There are other issues related to the economic situation. The political situation affects the economy, the regional economy, and the global economy. And all countries now, they suffer from economic stagnation or the critical recovery of the economy. Not only in Egypt, in other countries in the world, we have seen a shaken economy after COVID-19, the Russian-Ukrainian war, and the Israeli attacks on all these things are leading to a deteriorated economy at the global level. And the countries will resort to adaptation measures and will try to use diplomacy, will try to different tools in order to de-escalate. And in this respect, Dr. Eman, I wanted to ask you, so is Egypt doing anything, or is Egypt intending to have any diplomatic endeavors or efforts with the Houthis or with Iran in order to limit the actions of the Houthis or to have a kind of diplomacy? Egypt has a diplomatic course and is moving at the level of different stakeholders, the Houthis and Iran and the partners in the region, Saudi Arabia and UAE, as well as the partners at the international level, the United States and the United Kingdom. There have been different visits from heads of these states to Cairo and senior officials to Cairo, talking about the de-escalation and the Red Sea. So Cairo is pivotal here and is central to this. I expect that the diplomatic efforts from Egypt will be intensified, and maybe there could be different bargain chips with the Houthis in order to stop their attacks and threats, and some political gains could be given to the Houthis in order to have a political agreement for the Yemeni issue. And because the political process in Yemen is frozen, especially with the onset of the Gaza events, the political efforts in Yemen were frozen, and so reigniting that or reviving the political process could be important in order to produce a political solution between the North and the South, and to get out of the crisis in Yemen. I believe that these disturbances or this turmoil in the region led to a halt in these efforts or endeavors. I believe that the operation, the military operation, will not will not weaken the Houthis in the Red Sea and will not deter them from launching further attacks. I believe that the US and the UK strikes are ineffective in the field. At the political level, the feasibility of the Prosperity Guardian operation is questionable because this operation is not invested at the political level and is not taken seriously at the international level. There have been strikes against some Houthi targets, and this is all over the news, but these attacks on these strikes were not exploited at the political level, were not taken advantage on in order to revive the political process in Yemen. And they are not building on these operations in order to tackle some important files in the region. And this is not done by Cairo, Saudi Arabia, or the UAE, and the countries along the coastline of the Red Sea in order to find a solution for the crisis in the Red Sea. And for example, the United Kingdom announced that it is ceasing its attacks and will not launch any more attacks. And therefore, I think the situation in the field will change, and there will be some bargain chips on the table, and this will lead to a political process inside Yemen. And we'll see that and how it will manifest in the future. Well, thank you for this opinion. It's very bold. Your conclusion, Dr. Eman, that there will be a political bargain and that it will be inside Yemen and it will be part of the political process. So we'll move to the third topic of this webinar, and I'll start the first question with you, Dr. Eman. But before that, I would like to welcome those who joined us, the international emissions from the US, UK, and China, and some international figures who we have here to watch this webinar. Dr. Eman, further to your opinions that you expressed, how does Egypt sees the security of the Red Sea? It's a national security issue for Egypt, and it's a source of income for Egypt. So in case there is further escalations, and if there is if there are hostilities inside Yemen, or if there is a continued blockage of the ships, and this will affect the Egyptian economy and the Suez Canal. So how Egypt will react in order to ensure the security of the Red Sea? Well, Egypt can follow both tracks. Can follow diplomacy and the diplomatic track, and we have seen since the beginning of October, Egypt has been with the diplomatic track in order to resolve the issues in the region and talks in order to find solutions. Regarding the security of the Red Sea, I think there will be a bargain with the Houthis, and the political process will change, and pressure will be exercised by the US on Israel to stop its invasion of Gaza, and this will lead to de-escalation in the region. I believe that the Houthi attacks are related to what is happening in Israel and in Gaza, and trying to exercise pressure on Israel. And we should not forget that the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea are an attempt in order to redefine the Houthis as a key actor and player in the region, and to bring the Yemeni issue back to the international table. So it is an opportunity for the Houthis, for the axis of resistance. The Houthis are trying to achieve some political gains here. Thank you for that, Dr. Eman. I just wanted to hear from others on this issue in particular. I'll ask Dr. Marta here about the process or the operation. Washington Post discussed yesterday some US and UK officials said that they will expand the operation. The Bothon Archa, which was, I do not hear him well, the operation that started yesterday, and it will be more focused, and it will be a long-term process or operation. And this was agreed upon with the Europeans. It will be a long-term operation in order to secure commercial shipping in the Red Sea. Do you think that these strides or these actions are sufficient in order to provide security to the Red Sea?
Thank you for the question. And well, the short answer would be no. And we can recall some of the things that Fernando was saying before about the Houthis' capacity to, over the years, to, and also Jacob was referring to this, to decentralize camps, to hide, taking also advantage of the topography of Yemen to hide their weapons. But I think what is important to consider, and what perhaps there is a failure on part of the international community, and specifically US and UK, to understand, is how actually these strikes are feeding into the Houthi propaganda, how the Houthis, from their own perspective, are benefiting from these strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen. The uncomfortable truth that we are facing since this escalation started is that the Houthis are navigating the situation with much greater ease than the US, the UK, and their allies. The Houthis see these military attacks by the US and the UK as the golden opportunity to capitalize on pro-Palestinian attitudes and anti-foreign intervention sentiments that naturally prevail within Yemen, and also to recruit, as we've been seeing, new sympathizers, supporters, and even fighters. So if we look also at what was the situation within Houthi-controlled territories in northern Yemen before the Hamas-Israel war broke out, it is evident how this became also an opportunity for the Houthis to divert attention away from a disastrous situation that was dominated by rising fuel and food prices, unpaid public salaries, widespread unemployment, lack of economic opportunities, and brutal suppression of dissent by the Houthi security forces. And now these strikes are feeding into this propaganda, helping the Houthis to boost their image domestically within Yemen, both in and of themselves, but also worryingly vis-a-vis the legitimate government sitting in the south. And of course, they're also bolstering their image regionally. They're presenting themselves as the actor that within the region has taken the strongest stance against Israel in support of the Palestinians. And these strikes are actually recognizing the fact of the Houthi as a regional force, a regional actor that we cannot ignore, that we must and have to deal with. And finally, they're seeing as these attacks are further seen as an opportunity for the Houthis to strengthen, consolidate their posture within the regional landscape as part of the axis of resistance led by Iran, to obtain more support from Iran and its proxies. So recalling what we said at the beginning, to consolidate their position as a proxy of Iran and to acquire increasing visibility. So again, the short answer would be no into the success of these strikes, even if the operation gets expanded. There is a failure, I believe, to understand how the Houthis are actually benefiting from them. They wanted a war, so you cannot deter someone who wanted this situation of military confrontation.
دكتورة مارتا.
Dr. Marta, Muhammad Ali al-Houthi, he's a prominent leader in the Houthi group, and he said a few days ago that their attacks will cease in case the attacks on Gaza are stopped and if the blockade is lifted in Gaza. So do you think that this is credible? Do you think that what Muhammad Ali al-Houthi said is right? Will they be committed to that?
I think it depends when the confrontation in Gaza, if it ends, when it will end, and at that point, what will be the situation in terms of the Houthi-US confrontation. Is it going to happen in 1 week? Is it going to happen in a matter of months? So what will be the Houthi strength at that point? I think in general, the Gaza war was the golden, as I said, again, the golden opportunity for the Houthis to benefit domestically and regionally. I don't think they're truly doing it in terms of the Hamas-Israeli confrontation. Of course, again, it will depend on when the the Hamas-Israel war stops, what will be the situation then? And it is true that in the Houthis on motto there is death to Israel, so there is a component of also wanting to give further credibility to this motto, to this slogan. But again, I think that this needs to be read politically through the reality within Yemen rather than the Hamas-Gaza war, the Hamas-Israeli war.
هل هناك مجال للمجتمع الدولي دكتورة مارتا أن يتعامل؟
Dr. Marta, can the international community deal with the Houthis with more force or not the military actions, but could there be an international pressure on the Houthis, do you think?
I think in general, when it comes to the international community, I said before that there has been a failure, consistent failure to understand how these strikes fit into the Houthi propaganda. In general, this has been a failure consistent in the past 8-9 years to understand the Houthi. And when it comes to the international community today, I think there is a failure to understand these actions by the Houthi within the wider context. So they're treating them, these acts on part of the Houthis in isolation, while I think a better approach would be to look at this event in the wider context of the Yemeni civil war, in the wider context of the Yemeni peace process, and to connect these elements. So I think an approach would be to rebuild, strengthen support for the Yemeni legitimate government that we have in the south, also thinking that there could be a situation if things continue along this track in which the Houthis might not only interrupt of course, the negotiations with Saudi Arabia, but also re-escalate the internal confrontation for Marib. So I think there is a tendency to look at these elements in isolation, while they would rather be better connected, and the response should take this into account.
شكرا دكتورة مارتا.
Thank you, Dr. Marta. I will move to Mr. Fernando. The expansion of the operations and the launch of this recent operation yesterday against the Houthis, how will this affect the military participation from the EU in this conflict? Will the EU be engaged militarily, and how will they coordinate with the actors on the ground, including the STC, for example? And another question, the military actions inland, can they result in more effective results or outcomes?
Thank you, Ustad. Before I get to your two questions, if I may make a couple of comments to expand on what we heard from Furlan and Dr. Eman. One thing to keep in mind when we ask about the future threat from the Houthis, or will the Houthis end their threats in the Red Sea, the Houthis have now experienced a new level of success. What we've seen over the last 3 months is a new level of success. And this is as long as the Houthis are in control of Tehama, are in control of Sana'a, this is a permanent threat in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden and the Arabian Gulf, unlike what we saw in the 1970s with the oil embargo, because at that time, member states were dealing with member states. At the moment, we're dealing with a non-state actor who is in a permanent state of revolution. And they may want peace, but they do not want to govern. They do not want to turn into a government in the near term. I will agree with Dr. Eman and Dr. Furlan on the success of the Houthis to bolster their profile within the axis of resistance. Unlike Hezbollah, which has tremendous restraints at home in Lebanon, the Houthis are free to act. And this has bolstered their profile, not just in the region, not just in the Arab world and the Muslim world, but at the global level, where we see protesters in Europe and the US praising the actions by Houthis. So this definitely has bolstered their profile. And in turn, this position that the Houthis have today bolsters their position vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia and negotiations with Saudi Arabia, and vis-a-vis their Yemeni rivals on the ground. One interesting point that Dr. Eman made with regard to my suggestion of decoupling the Houthi operation with Gaza is, Yemeni actors cannot go against the Houthis as long as the Houthis claim that they are acting on behalf of the Palestinians, right? So al-Islah and Southerners, Sunni or Shia, they cannot criticize the Houthis as long as their narrative is we are doing this for the people of Palestine. Unfortunately, the tragedy of the war in Palestine, the tragedies against the Palestinians are not going to end tomorrow. And unfortunately, the Houthis will continue to use the Palestinian issue to advance their position in the axis of resistance. One interesting thing that I just noted when I looked at Twitter a little while ago is that the UN mission of Hodeidah just published a picture of their staff with the Galaxy Leader vessel in the background. This is the level of ineptitude on the part of UN and international agencies when it comes to their relations with the Houthi, because we know this is a Houthi choreographed picture, and they fell in the trap. And then they published it. They didn't even just keep it and roam it. They published it. This reminds me when Hans Grunderberg visited Sana'a, and the Houthis placed for the first time a picture behind the podium of a child being taken out of the rubble after a Saudi airstrike. This was on purpose. This picture in the Sana'a airport. So this is the level of propaganda that the Houthis are employing. With regards to your specific question on the expansion of the operation, we again need to be very careful on how we interpret the comments from the U.S. National Security Advisor or the spokespersons. Again, the U.S. Department of Defense said their Operation Prosperity Guardian was not going to target any Houthi leaders. This is beyond the scope of the operation. We've seen over there have been 3 rounds of strikes by the U.S. and the U.K. The UK government took credit of participation last night in the airstrikes yesterday, is that they are moving away from the north toward the center of Yemen, meaning Taiz, and then they hit Muqaydas in Al-Bayda. We know that the Houthis claimed last week that they would decentralize the launch pads, the missile and drone launch pads away from Sana'a. This is perhaps an opportunity for the U.S. and the British Air Force to hit new targets. As far as the land operations, I go back to my comment.
نعم السؤال في هذا الاتجاه.
Yes, please. The question is about the land operations. Mr. Aidarus Zubaydi, the head of the STC and the vice chairman of the PLC, said that he said in Davos forum that the airstrikes will not damage the Houthis unless there is a land operation, and this requires coordination, armament, and logistical support for the forces on the ground. And he means here the Southern forces and the anti-Houthi forces. So what's your assessment of that, Mr. Fernando?
Unfortunately, the fragmentation that persists within the government of Yemen, within the political leadership council, will not allow for this to happen. The fragmentation that exists in the PLC are and the differences between Saudi Arabia and the Emirates are unfortunately going to obstruct any potential delivery of training or weapons to Yemeni forces on the ground. Who do you give the weapons to? Do you get the weapons to Amalaka, but not the guards of the Republic? Do you give weapons to Amalaka and guards of the Republic, but not the Yemeni army? Under Islah, for example, in Sayyun and Madib and Taiz. This is problematic, and President Aidarus needs to understand that the U.S. is not about to directly deliver weapons to any Yemeni actor because Saudi Arabia is still the lead in this coalition. Unfortunately, to go back to pointing out my comment at the beginning where I say, Yemeni actors never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. In theory, the U.S. operation degrading the missile and drone capability of the Houthis would shift the balance of power on the ground because Yemeni forces lack an air force. Yemeni forces lack mid to long-range missiles, and they lack highly capable drones. And therefore, the Houthis have had an advantage of this. If the Operation Prosperity Guardian succeeds in its goal of degrading the Houthi missile and drone capabilities, this should be an opportunity on the ground. This should be leveling the field on the ground. But now, which forces are going to take advantage of this situation and attack the Houthis and engage the Houthis? We know that the SDC and the Southern forces have said multiple times that they will not cross the de facto north and south line. So this goes back to the Southern forces, Amalaka, Shabwa, Hadrami, elite forces, security belt forces. Are they willing to take advantage of a shift in the balance and cross the north and south line and engage the Houthis in Houthi territory? Or are they going to simply bolster the defensive position and prevent the Houthis from crossing that line in the near future? That is the question we need to ask the Houthi rival forces.
حسب ما يطرح بعض السياسيين الجنوبيين.
Well, according to some Southern politicians, Mr. Fernando, they say that if there are guarantees and political gains that can be achieved for them, and if there could be some principled achievements, they will participate in military operations in the north and will not take chances. They said that they will not take chances as happened in the Storm of Resolve because they do not achieve any political gains. What do you think about that?
If I may, definitely. No military strategist, no general is going to engage a ground operation without air support. That is just never going to happen. And so it doesn't see that we saw this in Marib when the Yemeni forces pushed the Houthis back from the dam area. They needed aerial support. And we saw Apaches, Saudi or Emirati Apaches, Emirati drones being utilized in support of those troops. We saw that being used for the SDC forces in Abiyan before 2019. We saw this also in Shabwa when the Houthis were pushed out of Bayhan. The U.S. unfortunately is not going to provide aerial support, air support for any Yemeni forces on the ground because the U.S. is not a party to the civil war. This shifts to the coalition, to Saudis and the Emirates. If they see the opportunity and they want to leverage the degrading of Houthi capabilities, will they step up and provide air support for the Yemeni army, for the Guards of the Republic, for Amalaka, for whichever force pushes north of the de facto line? Will they provide aerial support? And what type of aerial support? That is the question today. But to imagine the U.S. Navy or Air Force providing air support at the moment, it is outside, it is beyond the mandate.
وهذا السؤال نقوله أستاذ.
And this is the question that I ask to Mr. Yaqub from South24 in Aden. The key actors, including the Yemeni government and the STC, how will they face the Houthi escalation in the Red Sea, and what can they do? And the guarantees, the political guarantees, are they a condition for the Southerners to participate in any military operation to secure the Red Sea? Mr. Yaqub.
قبل الإجابة على هذا السؤال اسمح لي فقط بمرور سريع.
Before responding to this question, before you respond to this question, I wanted also to ask you on the first topic, the Houthi claim that they are launching this operation in support for Palestine and Gaza. Do you believe that this is right? Well, the Houthi story that their attacks are related to the war in Gaza and the events in Gaza. I believe that this story can be solved at the international level, but at the Yemeni level, we believe that the Houthis, in terms of principle, they do not hesitate conducting piracy operations. We have seen that against the UAE ship Rawafi, which was hijacked in January 2022, and now the Houthi military officials, before the Gaza events, they said that they were preparing for this sea battle for a long time. In July, the Houthis announced that they have tested some sea missiles and some advanced sea military capabilities, and their Minister of Defense said that they will not accept any external occupation of the Yemeni territorial waters, and he mentioned the Yemeni islands, and he delivered that statement or that speech in Hodeidah. And this uh, came months before the Palestinian attack on Israel and the horrific Israeli invasion of Gaza. So the Houthis wanted to do that for a long time, and they were expecting that, and the war on Gaza is an opportunity for the Houthis to start these attacks. So this is a strategic move by the Houthis. It's not a tactical move related to Gaza. It means that the Houthis are taking advantage of the current events and the regional position that is inadvertent against them. Regarding the question you asked, I believe that the anti-Houthi Yemeni parties are ready to take some steps against the Houthis, but these parties, they want to achieve some political gains out of this. For example, if we talk about the STC, this is the party that is brave in raising this, and the head of the STC, Idris Zubaydi, and other officials in the STC, they said that they are ready to participate in securing Bab al-Mandab Strait and in confronting the Houthis. And I think this position is based on different arguments, including the national security component, because Bab al-Mandab is very important for the south of Yemen. It is an integral part of the south, and the Houthi attacks are affecting the Yemeni population, including the people in the south. For the other parties in Yemen, I do not think that they have the same enthusiasm to act against the Houthis. So at the local level, I do not exaggerate when I say that the Southern forces are the only party that can be relied on for such an operation, if there is any ground operation. But what will be the price for that? It should be a recognition of the southern state, and the southern forces should receive the necessary support and funding and the intelligence sharing and all these things. And I sadly, this thing should have happened long time before these events, because the southern forces are fighting Al Qaeda and ISIS and other parties. I think time is upon us, and we have exceeded our time. I have the last question. It's about the peace process that is taking place now. The peace process is limited to certain parties, and some other parties were excluded, including the Southerners, and the Southerners were not consulted with. So what is happening now? How will it reshape the peace process and the roadmap announced by the UN Special Envoy? Well, these escalating events in the Red Sea, I think they will bring back the Yemeni crisis to square one. The STC issued a statement about the roadmap. The STC did not welcome the roadmap announced by the UN Special Envoy, and therefore I think more parties should be engaged in the peace process, including the STC, according to the Riyadh Agreement and consultations. I believe these events and developments may eliminate the attempts to strike a deal between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis, and the STC should be engaged as a key party in any processes. There is a question to Mr. Fernando talking about will the United States talk to Iran in order to curb the Houthi attacks on international shipping lines in the Red Sea? Mr.
Right.
Fernando?
Yes, there was a news report last week that the U.S. administration did send a message to the Houthis and Iran just before the designation was published. And this was particularly to engage on this talk. It is still then right after the news, it came out that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman contacted Iran, not just on the the issue of Gaza, but also on the Red Sea issue, trying to, again, as Dr. Furlan mentions, it cements the cycle, it cements the links between Iran and the Houthis, that no matter how much the Houthis want to say that they are a sovereign and an independent actor, they're not. I disagree that they're a puppet with the labeling of the Houthis as a puppet of Iran or a proxy of Iran, but we know that they are linked. We know that they operate in step with each other because the situation benefits both parties. As Dr. Furlan mentioned, the Houthis were a cheap tool for the Iranians back in 2006 through 2014. Now that the Houthis are emboldened, now that the Houthis have their own capabilities to manufacture specific components and up to a limited view, the drones, short-range drones themselves, that creates a little bit of independence, a little bit of strategic independence from Iran. The relationship is there to facilitate pressure on Saudi Arabia and now to take advantage of the war in Gaza. So definitely, we know that there are 3 ghost ships in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. 2 are operational right now. One of them was redeployed to Iran. These 2 ghost ships are known for years, not just since the Houthi strikes began, but these 2 ghost ships were known, identified by the US and Western allies as fundamental to Houthi drone and missile operations, providing target guidance assistance. We know that the shift from the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden happened when one of these ghost ships moved from the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. So it's no coincidence how the Houthi targeting has shifted to a wider area. So definitely, we hope that if the U.S. talks with Iran on the nuclear file, for example, are to progress this month in the coming 30 days, that Iran can influence to some degree the Houthis in order to de-escalate. But again, I reiterate, the Houthis have made it clear that the threat to shipping lanes through Bab al-Mandab is a permanent threat as long as they are in power in Sana'a.
سؤال للدكتورة مارتا.
Question to Dr. Marta. Question here saying the Houthis have been supported by the United States and the United Kingdom in the past, and they have used the Houthis in order to achieve some gains against Saudi Arabia and to pressure Saudi Arabia, as the case with ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So what is the difference between this and that, between Al-Qaeda, ISIS in Iraq and the Houthis? Do you think that the United States is credible in eliminating the Houthis entirely, or do you think that these are just provisional measures by the United States?
هل تسمعيني يا دكتورة مارتا؟ تفضلي.
Yes, thank you. I think that I would lean into calling them provisional measures, meaning that the limitation of the United States interest toward the Yemeni file, interest on getting serious progress on the negotiating table for the Yemeni population, for Yemen as a country, have been clear. I don't think that, and I was pointing before to the fact that I think there is a lack of interest, lack of understanding of how this connects to the Yemeni conflict, how these threats to the Red Sea global shipping are not something to be read in isolation or to be connected with the civil war in Yemen. I think that the United States are taking measures that respond to this specific threat that is also, as we were saying at the beginning, coming at a time of national elections in the country. So there is certainly pressure to react, to be seen as doing something. And this is why we have these limited strikes on specific targets within Yemen. I wouldn't read them as being part of a willingness to get further engaged in taking measures that are aiming to address the bigger picture. So I think that we are going to see the same pattern of response, limited strikes aimed at addressing this specific problem and a lack of willingness to see the bigger picture.
شكرا دكتورة مارتا. وطبعا
Thank you, Dr. Marta. And of course, I'd like to thank you all the participants and the audience. I'd like to thank all the panelists and the speakers, Dr. Marta, Furlan, the research program officer, the non-resident fellow at the Orion Policy Institute from Cairo. We had Dr. Eman Zahran, the political science teacher specializing in international relations and regional security, and the researcher with South24. And we also had Mr. Fernando Carvajal, the political expert and the former member of the UN Security Council panel of experts on Yemen. And we also had from Aden, Mr. Yaqub Alsufyani, the regional director of South24 office. In fact, the webinar was very rich and we had some very in-depth discussion and bold opinions were expressed. I'd like to thank the audience and those watching us live. And I'd like also to thank the members of the diplomatic missions who joined us from the countries that are interested in the Yemeni issue. So thank you very much. We were delighted to host you, and we appreciate all the opinions expressed, and they represent the views of the speakers. So thank you for watching, and see you next time.